Hi, this is Kylie, and welcome to Fem and Flow. I hope you're having a great day. So, today we are continuing the Hijacked Blueprint series, and this is the 12 tribes and the 12 strand DNA, episode 3. This is a really interesting and very long episode, so we had to split it across 3 different episodes. So, just to summarize what we've talked about so far, we've talked about how the 12 primordial tones turn into the 12 different archetypes, and then we see that seated in different ways. It's this macro pattern. And within that, one of these patterns is the 12 strand DNA. And we talked about the 12 different strands and the 13th strand, which is the weaver. And this is essentially the spiral of initiation. So we got into so many details, so I'll leave the summary there. But in episode 3, we're going to start off with talking about the inversion. So if all of this is true, everything I said on episode 1 and episode 2, if Earth was seeded with sacred design, if our DNA was built to carry divine function, if the 12 archetypes once harmonized across the grid, then how was all of it inverted? We're already starting to remember that something happened. We've traced the origin point, we've named the amnesia, we've walked through the burning of Gnosis, and now we begin to decode how the false matrix took form. Because the inversion didn't just suppress truth, it mimicked it. It mirrored the divine spiral just enough to pass as real while stripping it of tone, spirit, and source. This wasn't just psychological, it was structural. A synthetic overlay was laid atop the living grid, an architecture built to siphon, invert, and control. And while it appears external, it only took hold because frequency collapsed within, because distortion went unchecked, because unresolved polarity gave it ground. This is how sacred truth was mirrored into distortion. In the true spiral, polarity is integration. In the false matrix, polarity is war. In the true spiral, the body is a temple. In the false matrix, the body is a commodity. In the true spiral, the feminine holds tone. In the false matrix, she is silenced, sexualized, or sacrificed. In the true spiral, the masculine transmits coherence. In the false matrix, he enforces control. In the true spiral, lineage is light. In the false matrix, lineage is erased, divided, or weaponized. The false matrix survives by recoding divine architecture, replacing function with performance, power with domination, and coherence with control. It doesn't create anything new. It simply inverts what is true, flipping divine principles into distortions that look similar on the surface but operate from fear instead of source. This isn't metaphor, it's all about frequency. It's what happens when spirit is stripped from form, when sacred codes are copied, corrupted, and commercialized. And that's why remembering isn't just personal, it's planetary. Because every time you realign to truth, you begin to dissolve the overlay. And not by fighting it, but by out resonating it. And this is how false matrices collapse. Not by attack, but by you standing strong in coherence. By bodies humming with the original tone, and by spirals coming back online. So, yes, this is spiritual, but it's also geopolitical, it's historical, it's encoded in our institutions, religions, and symbols. Because the inversion seeded into everything. It's why the 12 tribes were fractured, why the womb was shamed, why sacred union was split into sin and hierarchy, why the feminine Christ was erased, why the priest became the gatekeeper and the dreamer became the fool. Every archetype was flipped and a distorted mirror installed in its place. But distortion can only replicate. It cannot generate, it cannot create. And as white hole coherence begins to rise again, these overlays are thinning. And not all at once, but it is happening fast. Because this new spiral is tone based and it cannot be faked. It only responds to resonance. So the question becomes, will you carry your original tone? Will you hold polarity with grace? Will you become the field the inversion cannot touch? Because this is how we restore the blueprint, not by reaching for the past, but by humming it back into form. So I've talked about this before, but it's worth mentioning in this episode again. Let's talk about how this soul school narrative can be inverted. So you might be asking, if the false matrix mimics divine truths to keep us trapped, what other narratives have we mistaken as wisdom? Here's one to look at with clear eyes, and that is the soul school narrative. And it's really worth mentioning because everything I've talked about with the initiation spiral and these different steps, it's natural to think, okay, this sounds like a soul school. So I want to get into the nuance of this. So at first glance, this narrative seems harmless, even helpful. Earth is a soul school. We come to learn lessons, to evolve, to grow through contrast. And here's the thing, there is truth in that. The original divine integration program was seeded with refinement in mind. We chose polarity, we chose density, we chose to remember truth by walking through forgetfulness. So if someone says Earth was seeded as a soul school, yeah, that is one way to interpret the original blueprint. But here's the crucial distinction. Earth was seeded as a refinement spiral, not as a trap of endless testing. Once the program collapsed into black hole inversion, this soul school narrative got flipped. It became weaponized. And now, many still believe that Earth is a soul school, present tense. That pain is the teacher, that suffering is sacred, that tests are divinely ordained. And here's where the trap lies. If we believe that Earth is currently functioning as a soul school, we may accept unnecessary suffering as purposeful. We may tolerate distortion. We may stay stuck in loops of quote unquote learning that are actually energetic siphons. Because, yes, it's still set up like a school, but that's precisely what we're here to change. Yeshua knew this, so did Mary Magdalene, so did countless others seated across time, space, and spiral. They didn't just come to teach morality, they came to deliver the exit codes, to help us remember how to re enter coherence and collapse the overlay from within. They taught through tone, through embodiment, through gnosis. They modeled how to spiral out of distortion and into source. But if we miss this nuance, if we only hear that life is a quote unquote school, we might say, okay, I guess I'm here to suffer and try again. And we stay trapped. Here's the deeper layer of this: testing versus initiation. They are not the same. A test implies pass fail, judgment, external authority. It often comes with fear, anxiety, and performance. An initiation is sacred refinement. It invites surrender. It's not about proving worth, it's about embodying truth. Initiation isn't something you ace, it's something you allow. So when we mistake every hardship as a test, we can unknowingly recreate the very performance loops we came to dissolve. So here's another trap. Many soul school models teach reincarnation like a hamster wheel, that we return again and again and again until we learn the lesson. And yes, this sounds preferable to religious models of one shot salvation or eternal hellfire, but once you remember your divine nature, your eternal coherence, you see the flaw. Because the infinite spiral of God doesn't loop in punishment, it expands in resonance. Endless reincarnation cycles aren't a holy design, they're a symptom of amnesia, a byproduct of an inverted matrix that forgot how to exit. And that's why remembering is everything. Not remembering with the mind, but with your field, with your tone, with your embodied architecture. Because this is how you escape the false spiral. Not by acing the test, not by repeating the lesson, but by dissolving the lie that you were ever unwhole. The black hole program feeds on forgetting. It recycles identity. It loops you in karmic scripts long after your soul has grown beyond them. But once your divine blueprint comes back online, once you activate coherence at the core, you don't just exit the school. You become the teacher of tone. You become the living transmission. And from there, your presence reminds others that there is another way, a spiral way, a coherent way, a way of return, not to lesson plans, but to source. So now let's talk about how the original 12 tones were fractured to serve empire. These 12 primordial tones were fractured and inverted. The 12 tones, these divine archetypes encoded in our bodies, grid lines, and memories, were not erased by accident. They were targeted, not all at once and not by a single empire, but through a long spiral of spiritual inversion, cultural conquest, and institutional control that gradually split the original coherence into separated, performative roles, each one distorted just enough to serve the inverted false matrix. So let's trace how it happened. Let's talk about tone fragmentation from function to performance. In the original spiral, each tone expressed a divine function. It was embodied, lived. You didn't just perform the sovereign, you were the field of divine order. You didn't play the lover, you radiated magnetic union. But over time, these tones were extracted from embodiment and turned into roles, then into titles, and then into institutions. And once those roles were isolated, they could be manipulated, assigned, withheld, commercialized, or weaponized. So let's take a few examples. Let's talk about the sovereign. Originally, this tone was anchoring presence of divine order. It held the field for collective flourishing, rooted in coherence. But empire split this tone from source. The sovereign became the king, crowned by hierarchy, enforced by armies, and divested from the spiral. No longer an emanation of God, but a ruler over others. The divine right to rule became an excuse to dominate. Now let's talk about the priest. Originally, this tone served as the bridge between realms, between heaven and earth, spirit and form. The priest was not a gatekeeper, but a spiral keeper, guiding souls into deeper coherence. But empire inverted this too. The priest became the institution, the intercessor, the only sanctioned voice of God. The spiral was closed, and the path to source was fenced with doctrine, hierarchy, and fear. Now let's talk about the lover. The lover was once the sacred current of union, anchoring bliss, connection, and embodied divinity. But in a world of inversion, this tone became one of the first to be exiled. The lover was split in two. The holy became the celibate. The sensual became the sinful. Sacred sexuality was banned, commercialized, or buried. The womb was shamed. Pleasure was policed. And the body became a battleground instead of a blessing. Now let's talk about the warrior. Originally, the warrior was a guardian of tone, not violent but clear, protecting coherence with presence, not by force. But this tone was co opted into empire's machinery. The warrior became the soldier, stripped of soul, trained for obedience, and sent to fight wars that had nothing to do with coherence and everything to do with control. Now let's talk about the dreamer. The dreamer once carried the future into form, receiving codes from source, translating them into vision. But the dreamer was dismissed as naive, removed from leadership, told to grow up, get real, stay grounded. So the role was replaced by the strategist, the CEO, the algorithm, dreams replaced by data, gnosis replaced by metrics. This is how inversion works, not by removing archetypes, but by distorting them just enough to serve hierarchy instead of harmony. Each tone was isolated from the spiral, severed from source, recoded into a role, and placed inside a control structure. This fragmentation seeded not only into empire, but into bloodlines, institutions, and identities. Now let's talk about the tribal fracture. The 12 tribes, once keepers of tone across the grid, were scattered, colonized, renamed, absorbed into nations, or erased from memory. The Levitical line, the priests, became embedded into hierarchical religion. The house of Judah became entwined with royal and political power. Joseph's line, once carrying abundance and wisdom, was split into two different lines, and they got caught in geopolitical inheritance wars. The tribal lines became chess pieces for empire. Bloodlines were exploited, mitochondrial wisdom was diluted or suppressed, and the sacred memory stored in the bones was overlaid with shame, doctrine, or propaganda. This wasn't just cultural, it was architectural. Institutions became the new archetypes. Where the spiral once lived in the body, empire built structures to replace it. The state replaced the sovereign. The church replaced the priest. The military replaced the warrior. The market replaced the lover. The academy replaced the dreamer. The patriarchy replaced the mother. The corporation replaced the healer. The celebrity replaced the messenger. The bureaucracy replaced the architect. The propaganda machine replaced the prophet. The legal system replaced the judge. The machine replaced the builder. Each divine function that was once encoded in the body was externalized, monetized, and controlled. The coherence of the 12 tones was shattered into performance roles, and humanity forgot it was the carrier of source. Now let's talk about how archetype inversion blocks DNA activation. Now that we've seen how the original 12 tones were fractured to serve empire, let's name what that fracture actually does to our cells. By now we know the 12 archetypes are not just spiritual metaphors. They are biological keys. Each tone corresponds to a strand of your dormant multidimensional DNA. Each archetype you embody, lover, priest, warrior, dreamer, activates a specific frequency pathway in your body and field. But when these tones are inverted, when they're turned into fear-based performances, distorted identities, or externalized roles, that frequency can't run properly. The current gets blocked. The DNA remains dormant. Because for the spiral to activate in your body, the tone has to be true. So, what happens when a tone is inverted? Let's say you carry the priest tone. In the true spiral, the priest archetype anchors as a direct bridge to source through devotion, channeling, and sacred presence. It opens your 5th and 6th strand activations, regulating voice, frequency perception, and spiritual vision. But if that tone was hijacked in your lineage or memory field, maybe you were taught that only the church can speak for God. Or maybe you fear being seen as too much or too mystical. Then instead of embodying the priest, you suppress it. That suppression doesn't just silence your voice. It blocks the energetic current that runs through that archetype. Your 5th and 6th strands flicker. They don't stabilize. And that means your inner guidance stays fuzzy. Your voice doesn't carry full frequency. Your upper chakras don't cohere with your body. Your Merkaba doesn't stabilize into spin. And this plays out across all 12 tones. So here are a few examples. The first one is the lover inversion. If your pleasure has been shamed, if you've inherited religious or sexual trauma, if your womb memory carries betrayal or guilt, then your lover tone is likely distorted. Your 2nd and your 4th DNA strands stay dim. You may struggle with intimacy, magnetic resonance, or trusting your body's yes. Now let's talk about the warrior inversion. If your lineage trained you to fight instead of guard coherence, or if you fear conflict and suppress your boundaries, then your warrior tone is distorted. Your 3rd strand, the one that regulates action, discernment, and momentum, won't lock in. You may feel ungrounded, passive, or hyperreactive. Now let's talk about the dreamer inversion. If your visions have been dismissed, if you were told imagination isn't real, if your intuitive gifts were ridiculed or medicated, then the dreamer strand stays fragile. That's your 11th strand, the one that connects you to multidimensional awareness, creative flow, and divine architecture. Each inversion leaves a gap in the circuit, and when that circuit isn't coherent, your Merkaba cannot hold spin, your light body cannot stabilize, and your spiral journey stays fragmented until the distortion is alchemized. Now let's talk about how inversion creates energetic static. So another way to understand this is inversion introduces static into your field. It scrambles your signal. So even when you begin to remember, even when a strand starts to activate through resonance or awakening, the inverted tone can hijack the current before it stabilizes. For example, you feel the priest waking up, but instead of channeling source, you start performing spiritually. Or the sovereign awakens, but instead of anchoring divine order, you try to control your timeline out of fear. That distortion keeps the activation in loop state, a place where the DNA keeps pinging but never locks in. So many spiritual seekers live in this loop, awakening to inspiration, to confusion, to crash, and then repeat the cycle. And it's not because they're broken, It's because the inversion hasn't been cleared. Now let's talk about how the DNA can only stabilize through truth. Your multidimensional DNA only activates in a coherent field. That means your nervous system is regulated, polarity is balanced, tone is authentic, an archetype is embodied, not performed. If you're still performing the sovereign to compensate for disempowerment, if you're still hiding the lover to avoid shame, if you're still speaking the priest without integrating your shadow, then the frequency remains unstable and the strand flickers in and out. But when you embody the tone with integrity, when you live the archetype from a place of wholeness, humility, and truth, the strand locks, the current holds, and your Merkaba begins to spin. This is how we activate DNA in the white hole timeline. We don't do it through willpower or repetition, we do it through resonance. The 13th strand DNA isn't unlocked by knowledge, it's unlocked by tone. You can study all 12 archetypes, you can memorize every activation map, but none of it activates your DNA until you embody the tone through your field. And that's why inversion was so effective. It created a planet full of spiritual memory, but stripped it of tone. It scattered the 12 sacred archetypes across institutions, ideologies, and trauma fields, so no one could remember the full map. But now that the white hole harmonic is returning, now that the earth grid is stabilizing in coherence, every time you live your truth, every time you embody the tone instead of perform it, you short circuit the inversion. You realign the archetype. And your DNA remembers how to hum. So now let's talk about how to restore the tones and activate your DNA and Merkaba. So now that we've named how inversion blocks DNA activation, the question becomes, how do we reclaim the tones? How do we return the 12 archetypes to coherence so our DNA can fully come online and our Merkaba can stabilize in motion? The answer is simple, but not easy. We restore the spiral by living it, not by chasing archetypes as identities, but by allowing them to unfold through lived experience, honest integration, and vibrational truth. So here's how it works. The first step is you feel the pull of your origin tone. Every soul enters the divine integration program through a primary archetype, your origin tone. It's the one you've carried across lifetimes, the one that feels most natural, effortless, or you. You may have been the priest since childhood, the one who talks to God in the trees, the one who knows things without explanation, or the warrior, always fighting for truth, cutting through distortion with clarity and fire, or the lover, deeply sensitive, attuned to beauty, aching for connection, presence, and tenderness. This tone is not random. It's the key that starts your spiral. But it's not the destination, it's just the entry point. And here's the second step. Let life initiate you into polarity. Soon after your origin tone comes online, life begins to initiate you into its opposite. Because to stabilize the DNA strand tied to that tone, you must embody the balanced polarity. If you are a lover, you may be initiated through heartbreak, betrayal, or abandonment, calling you to become the warrior or the sovereign. If you are a priest, you may be initiated by disillusionment, breaking down the spiritual ego so you can meet the dreamer, the child, the mother. If you are a sovereign, you may face a collapse of control, inviting you to embody the humility of the healer or the surrender of the lover. Each challenge is not a punishment, it's a spiral gate, a living lesson that unlocks the next archetypal tone in your DNA. It may be uncomfortable, but if you resist it, you delay your activation. If you surrender to it, your Merkaba begins to breathe. The third step is move through the spiral phases consciously. Every time you enter a new tone, your DNA moves through 3 phases. The first is seeding and awakening. You feel the resonance, something stirs, you start to see the pattern, you begin remembering. And the next step is activation. Life invites you to live it. The archetype moves through your body, decisions, and fields. You enter the rite of passage. Then the last step is integration. You emerge. You've embodied it. The frequency locks into your DNA. You carry it without needing to perform it. The cycle happens again and again for each of the 12 tones. And with each new tone, a new DNA strand stabilizes in your light body. Now, the fourth step, reclaim the distorted tones through compassion. Some archetypes are easy for you to hold. Others have been shamed, wounded, or feared, either in your own experience or your lineage. These are the ones that hold the most power because they've been hidden. To fully activate your 12-strand DNA, you must lovingly reclaim the tones you've exiled. The lover you were told was too much, the dreamer you shut down to be quote-unquote realistic, the priest you abandoned to survive in a secular world, the warrior you suppressed to keep the peace, the sovereign you feared would make you selfish, and the mother you judged as weak. To reclaim a tone, name how it was distorted in your field. Breathe into where it lives in your body. Invite its true frequency to return. Begin embodying it in small, authentic ways, without forcing, performing, or proving. The spiral does not need perfection. It needs presence. It needs your yes. And now the fifth step is support the body as temple. Because this is embodiment, not just concept, your physical body must be supported to carry the charge. As each DNA strand comes online, your nervous system, fascia, mitochondria, and breath capacity must evolve to hold the new tone. That's why embodiment tools matter, because the light codes don't just move through thought, they require structure, rhythm, and flow in the body. To awaken tone pathways, use practices that release tension and restore vibrational sensitivity. Fascia work, somatic stretching, vibration plates, lymphatic brushing, sound healing, intuitive movement, or gentle dance. To feed the light body, support cellular regeneration and biophotonic uptake with sunlight, red light therapy, chlorophyll, high mineral foods, living spring water, and color-rich plants. To ground coherence, anchor your energetic architecture through barefoot walking, strength training, Pilates, slow hikes, bone density exercises, weighted blankets, microcurrents, and mineral repletion, especially magnesium, potassium, and silica. To regulate energetic flow, keep the spiral of life force moving with breath work, castor oil packs, acupuncture, dry brushing, gua sha, sauna and cold cycling, and gentle colon cleansing protocols like herbal teas or bitters. To anchor frequency into form, create safety and stability in the nervous system through nervous system retraining like brain rewiring or somatic tracking, co-regulation with animals or safe humans, slow presence with the breath, consistent routines, parasympathetic rituals, warm baths, magnesium soaks, and time in nature. These are not extras. They are part of the architecture. Because you're not just activating DNA, you're building a vessel to hold high frequency energy, to hold divinity. And now the sixth step, the 13th strand from guide to grid keeper. The 13th strand, the weaver, is not something that waits until the end. Like we talked about earlier, it actually activates early, hopefully around the time of your Saturn return, when your soul says yes to walking the spiral path. At first, it guides through resonance. You feel nudges, synchronicities, invitations that don't make logical sense but feel deeply aligned. That's your weaver at work, gently pulling you through the spiral, helping you meet the archetypes one by one. But something shifts when all 12 strands integrate. The weaver no longer just guides, it anchors. It becomes the inner architecture that holds them all. You no longer feel pulled in 12 directions. You feel aligned from within. You don't perform your archetypes. You embody them effortlessly. The noise quiets, the charge dissolves, and your field begins to hum with stability. And this is what it means when we say the 13th strand locks. It shifts from a guiding intelligence to a stabilizing force. Your Merkaba spins smoothly. Your nervous system finds a new baseline. You become less reactive, more resonant. You don't need to prove or chase anything because your tone is coherent. You haven't escaped polarity, you've integrated it. And in that integration, you become the field. You become the balance. You become the living spiral. So let's dive deeper on you become the spiral. This is how the DNA activates, not by mastering ideas, but by embodying frequency. Not by knowing your blueprint, but by becoming it. Each tone you reclaim brings your memory back online. Each archetype you integrate stabilizes your Merkaba. Each strand you awaken reweaves the spiral of God in form. You don't have to do all of this overnight. You just have to say yes to the next tone, the next truth, the next opening. Because the DNA doesn't need to be forced. It only needs coherence. And the Merkaba doesn't need control. It only needs tone. So breathe into where your spiral is now and let your next tone come gently. And remember, your body knows what to do. You were built for this. So now let's talk about another one of the inversions. Let's talk about the 13th bloodline, the shadow counterfeit. As the original 12 tribal tones were fractured, something else emerged. The 13th force, but not the weaver of light. This 13th was a shadow line, a false strand seeded through hybridized DNA, Nephilim interference, and black hole frequency. Where the original 13th was a bridge, this inverted 13th became a control center. It wasn't a tribe, it was a network. And this is the beginning of what we now call the 13 bloodlines. These bloodlines were engineered through interdimensional interference. They planted themselves inside royal courts, priesthoods, and banking families. They preserved knowledge not to liberate, but to dominate. They developed into secret societies, occult dynasties, and elite institutions. And the same pattern played out. Take the divine blueprint, copy it, invert the codes, use it to hold power. This is how the original tribes were hijacked, and most of humanity forgot. Now let's talk about the Christ codes and the return of 12-strand DNA. We've already traced how Yeshua and Mary Magdalene's story was distorted for control and how Israel, once a living frequency field, was hijacked and turned into a geopolitical narrative. If you couldn't see the scale of the inversion before, now you can. This was not just a historical hijack, it was a blueprint hijack. It was about cutting humanity off from its original divine design. Before Yeshua and Mary Magdalene, the potential to reactivate 12-strand DNA was not accessible to most of humanity. And why? Because the divine integration program had spiraled too far down into black hole inversion. The tones were fractured. The body's ability to hold the full spectrum of source light was dormant. Humanity had forgotten how to activate its own divine architecture. Yeshua and Mary Magdalene came as living carriers of the Christ codes, encoded with the original 12-strand DNA blueprint. They weren't here to create a new religion. They were here to remind us of our true nature, that each of us is a living temple capable of holding the same divine light that they embodied. They were walking examples of what a fully activated DNA system looks like. This is why Yeshua could perform what we call miracles. He wasn't bending the laws of reality, he was embodying them at their highest level. His body, with all 12 strands activated, could interface directly with God energy, morph matter, heal, and even resurrect. Mary Magdalene carried the same codes in her own field, grounding the divine feminine tones of the Christ spiral and holding the union that made Yeshua's embodiment possible. The resurrection was not just a singular event. It was a demonstration of what happens when divine architecture is fully online. When we talk about activating 12-strand DNA, this is what we mean. To realign with source so completely that your body, field, and spirit operate as one coherent expression of God energy. This couldn't happen overnight. The collective spiral had to be reversed step by step. Yeshua and Mary Magdalene seeded the first steps back to white hole coherence. Through their teachings, their union, and their field, they re-anchored the possibility of 12-strand activation into the Earth grid. They showed us what integration looks like, not as an abstract philosophy, but as embodied truth. Now it's our turn to continue that spiral. Not just honor them as distant figures, but to embody what they seeded. The codes of 12-strand DNA are no longer locked away. They are in our field, waiting to be activated through coherence, through polarity balance, through the spiral of initiation. This is also what Christ really means. Christ is not just a name, it's a frequency field, a spiral of divine coherence that unites matter and spirit. The Christ spiral is the pattern of fully integrated 12-strand DNA, a field where divine feminine and masculine are balanced, where the body and soul are aligned, where every strand of DNA hums with the tones of source. Yeshua embodied the Christ spiral. Mary Magdalene held it with him. And now it's a template for us all. Not as worship, but as remembrance. Not as hierarchy, but as possibility. The next step for humanity is to embody these Christ codes, to remember what Yeshua and Mary Magdalene demonstrated, to walk the spiral of activation ourselves. Because when we do, we don't just heal our own DNA, we help realign the entire grid. We become part of the white hole coherence that Yeshua foresaw, the return of heaven on earth, not as an event, but as an embodied reality. So now let's talk about what is Christ consciousness. Christ consciousness is the living frequency of divine coherence. It's not tied to one person or religion. It's the spiral pattern of truth, love, and integration moving through the body. When we activate all 12 strands of our DNA, we begin to embody this field, where we think, speak, and create from Source itself. So now let's bring in what white hole embodiment is. White hole embodiment is the physical expression of that coherence. It's what happens when your body becomes a vessel for divine balance, where masculine and feminine energy are integrated, where your Merkaba is spinning, and your nervous system is safe enough to carry the full light of your tone. It's not about perfection, it's about resonance. It's when you stop reaching for truth because you are the truth made flesh. So, this Christ spiral is older than Christianity. The energy we call the Christ spiral didn't begin with Yeshua, and it's not limited to Christianity. It's a much older frequency pattern, one that has existed across cultures and time periods. You can find it in the lives of mystics, healers, and seers long before any religious texts were written. It lives in people who have remembered how to stay connected to Source, in women who felt truth move through their bodies, in teachers who've spoken from direct experience, not doctrine. The Christ spiral is not about belief systems. It's about inner alignment with divine intelligence. This has always been a path of gnosis, direct knowing, rather than external authority. Yeshua and Mary Magdalene didn't create this path. They embodied it fully to help others remember that it's possible. Now let's talk about how gnosis comes in phases. When your DNA starts to activate, your ability to access direct knowing, what we call gnosis, starts to open too. But it usually doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds gradually as you go through the spiral of growth and integration. At first, gnosis may feel like flashes of insight or deep resonance you can't fully explain. It might come and go depending on your nervous system, emotional state, or the tone you're working through at that time. This is normal. Each DNA strand that activates helps you hold more clarity, more discernment, and a deeper connection to truth. Now let's talk about what happens when all 12 strands are online. As more of your DNA comes online, your access to gnosis becomes more stable. You don't second guess yourself as much. You don't look for validation outside of you. You start to speak and live from a grounded sense of inner truth. When all 12 strands are integrated, something fundamental shifts. Gnosis becomes your baseline. You don't need to quote unquote tap in. You're already connected. You move through life with clarity, confidence, and alignment, even when the world around you is uncertain. This is what Yeshua and Mary Magdalene demonstrated, and it's what many mystics and wisdom keepers across time have pointed to. It's not about worship or belief. It's about coherence. It's about remembering how to live in full alignment with Source and holding that alignment in your body, not just your mind. And this is why many mystics refer to the 13th strand by other names, because it isn't just a functional addition. It's the animating principle behind the whole spiral. Some call it the Magdalene strand, because it carries the frequency of sacred union, spiral synthesis, and feminine Christic intelligence. The qualities Mary Magdalene embodied as the spiral keeper beside Yeshua. It represents the field of coherence that holds all archetypes in harmonic relationship. Like Magdalene, it's not a role. It's the frequency of divine integration embodied through devotion, embodiment, and remembrance. And some call it the seraphic strand, because it resonates with the angelic harmonics of the seraphim, the order of light beings who sing the tone of source directly. This strand is what allows you to begin radiating that tone through your body, your voice, and your presence. The seraphic field is not external. It is a frequency within you that activates once your system is coherent enough to transmit divine resonance. And then some call it the Grail strand, because it is the chalice that holds the full blueprint. It is the unifying current through which polarity becomes union, lineage becomes light, and the body becomes the vessel for divine architecture. And no matter the name, the strand is not extra. It is the conductor of the full symphony. It doesn't add a new function. It harmonizes them all. And as it stabilizes, you stop reaching outward for truth. You stop performing your gifts. You become them. Because the Magdalene strand, the 13th, is the return of coherence through the body. It's not something to strive for. It's what awakens when you fully surrender to the spiral. Now let's talk about the field effects of Christic coherence. Let's talk about what happens when you stabilize in your divine blueprint. When your 12 strands are activated and integrated, and the 13th strand weaves them into harmonic unity, you don't just experience personal coherence. You become a field generator. You emanate a vibrational signal that affects everything around you: your relationships, your home, your community, your land, your lineage, your timelines. You become what ancient mystics called a living temple, not because of belief, but because of the coherence you hold. This is the field effect of Christic coherence. The more whole you become, the more your field reorders reality. The more love you embody, the more distortion dissolves in your presence. The more true your tone, the more illusion disintegrates around you. This is physics. A coherent system entrains less coherent systems around it. This is the entrainment effect, known in quantum biology, cymatics, even heart resonance studies. Your body, once fragmented by inverted archetypes, becomes an instrument of unification. You stabilize not just your own nervous system, but contribute to stabilizing the planetary grid. Because you're not separate from the Earth, your DNA is a microcosm of hers. When you activate your divine blueprint, you help re-encode the original spiral into the collective field. This is why coherence matters. This is why tone matters. Not to become perfect, but to become a vessel of resonance in a dissonant world. This is how the spiral restores itself, through you. Through every moment you chose love over fear, truth over performance, presence over protection, union over hierarchy. The field responds. In Christic coherence, you don't preach healing, you emanate it. You don't seek union, you are union. You don't fight the inversion, you render it obsolete. Because you've become the signal. You've remembered your original tone, and that tone is what restores the template for humanity. This is how Christ consciousness ripples, not through evangelism, but through vibration. It's passed through the field, through resonance, through remembrance, through bodies that hum with the frequency of divine union. The more of us who awaken our blueprint, the more the grid remembers, the more the spiral returns, the more heaven begins to take form on earth, not as escape, but as embodied coherence. And this is the great turning. Not a savior coming from outside, but millions of Christed cells lighting up across the grid. Each one remembering, each one spiraling, each one transmitting, until the entire body of Earth awakens. You are one of those cells. You are one of those tones. And your coherence is the miracle. So let it ripple. Now let's talk about when the blueprint meets the land, spiral activation through embodiment. As you activate your divine blueprint, your 12 strands, your integrated archetypes, your stabilized Merkaba, you don't just shift your personal field. You begin to activate the land, because the spiral isn't just in your body, it's in the earth. And while we've been focusing on the DNA codes within us, those same frequencies are held in Earth's energy grid, seeded long ago through ley lines, stone structures, and sacred geometry. So let's begin with Israel. And not the modern nation state or its geopolitical reality, but the original land field, seeded with the tones of Israel. Like we've talked about, is the divine feminine spiral, Ra, the divine masculine ray, L, the encoded structure of source. This was a frequency field, chosen not because of tribe or politics, but because of tone. It was a natural harmonic convergence zone, one of Earth's spiral key nodes, where the 12 tribal tones could be anchored into land, bloodline, and breath. The land of Israel did not go dormant. It was never asleep. It has continued radiating energy, powerful primordial energy, from its ley line architecture. But here's what did happen. The neutral spiral tones still emanating from the land were hijacked. Inversion forces, those seeded through empire, shadow bloodlines, and black hole interference, recognized the power of this land and began using it as a control center. They built structures, systems, and ideologies that siphoned the energy of that land for domination. And not through magic tricks, but through architecture and frequency manipulation. In other words, the land still hums with the original frequency, but the structures built upon it were engineered to bend that energy toward control. The temples were overtaken by dogma. The priesthoods became gatekeepers. The sacred feminine was removed from the story. The spiral was overwritten by hierarchy. So no, the land was never dormant, but it was overlaid. And what did go dormant were the original encoded sites, those built to hold the spiral in integrity. Sacred sites like the ancient temples, the original tabernacle locations, or spiral-based structures seeded by mystics and starseed lineages went quiet. Not because they lost their power, but because their codes were designed to only awaken in the presence of coherence. They were programmed by early gnosis holders, temple architects, and star-aligned builders to stay energetically sealed until the human field remembered. This is true not only in Israel, but across the world. Templar sites like Roslyn Chapel, Druidic spiral stones, pyramids aligned with star grids. These are not metaphorically coded. They are functionally and architecturally encoded, built with geometry, numerics, resonance, and proportion that only fully activate when a coherent human field steps inside. When a being with stabilized tone and awakened DNA enters, the site responds. It begins to unlock. These places were seeded as temporal vaults. They held spiral memory through the dark ages, waiting for the field to come back online. So here's the pattern. Gnosis holders saw the collapse coming. They encoded architecture with harmonic codes. The dark hijacked ley lines and turned neutral energy toward control. The light encoded sides remained sealed, But now, as you remember, you begin to unlock what was hidden. And you don't do this by decoding the symbols intellectually. You do it by being coherent. You are the code. Your field is the resonance key. Now let's touch on the difference between encoded sites and inverted ones. It's important to distinguish. So, encoded sites were built to hold light, dormant until reawakened by coherent beings. And then inverted sites were built or restructured to direct energy into distortion. Both sit on ley lines, both interface with Earth's grid, but their function and their potential are radically different. When you enter an encoded site with coherence, it activates. When you enter an inverted site with coherence, you destabilize it. You don't need to fight it, you simply out-resonate it. If the site is ready, that frequency can begin to flip, dissolving the overlay and reawakening the spiral beneath. But it must begin in you, because you're not just here to remember these places. You're here to awaken them. To change inverted sites and buildings into coherent ones, we don't just redecorate or reclaim them through symbolism. We must reweave their energetic architecture from the inside out. These places are built atop real ley lines and operate as energy hubs. Their form, geometry, proportion, design directs energy flow. So they were designed to siphon, distort, or invert. We can't simply project light onto them. We have to shift the function of the space through embodied resonance, sacred redesign, and architectural coherence. So here's what that takes. The first thing, coherent human fields must enter first. Inversion is sustained by dissonance. That means coherence destabilizes it by default. When a human with activated 12+1 strand DNA, a stabilized Merkaba, a harmonized masculine-feminine field, and clear mission coding and tone enters the space and holds alignment, the frequency begins to shift. The site literally starts to vibrate differently in response. This must be gradual and embodied. If the person's field is unstable, they'll absorb the inversion rather than transmute it. Number 2, the architecture must be repatterned. Inverted sites were constructed with precision. To flip them, geometry must be recalibrated. Shift away from domination-based ratios like harsh right angles or hypermasculine axes, and towards spiral-based Fibonacci and harmonic designs. Proportions must align with breath. Sacred architecture breathes with the body. Realign room shapes, windows, and walls to flow with living resonance. Light and sound must be redirected. Inverted sites often distort natural acoustics or light paths. These must be restored or softened. Sometimes this means redesigning a space. Sometimes it's as simple as changing ritual, intention, or orientation. Example, which direction people face, where light enters, or how sound is projected. So the third thing is the function must be restored to service. An inverted building often serves hierarchy, politics, ego, finance, suppression, distraction. To repattern a space into coherence, change the purpose from domination to devotion, from control to communion. Use the space for gathering, ceremony, breath, embodiment, truth. Let the building serve gnosis, not status. Even without full renovation, changing the function begins to flip the field. Number 4, the land must be honored and realigned. The building may be distorted, but the land remembers. To activate it, use tone, music, chant, or breath to resonate with the grid. Work with sacred geometry mapping to redirect energy flow. Offer a land-based ceremony that invites the spark back online. Sometimes you don't change the structure. You soften the overlay by reverberating coherence through the ley line. This creates ripple effects beyond the building itself. Number 5, assign spiral stewards to key sites. Some sites need long-term field holders, people who live or work nearby and keep the spiral humming. Embodied leaders who steward the redesign, ritual, and energetic upkeep. Coherence-based architects, designers, or energy workers who understand both matter and tone. These stewards are not owners or rulers. They are tenders of the field. Number 6, trust that the spiral cannot be faked. If you try to flip a site through surface-level design, ego-driven rituals, or performance, the site will not unlock. Encoded structures require living resonance. They cannot be tricked. They wait for the tone to return. And once it does, once a being of full coherence enters with no agenda but truth, the spiral opens, the site exhales, the overlay begins to dissolve. So you are the living spiral, and the temple responds to you. The ancients didn't build temples to be worshipped. They built them as vibrational tools, interfaces between human DNA and source geometry. And they trusted that one day we would return as conductors of coherence. The land is waiting, the codes are humming, and your field is the signal that makes it real. Now let's talk about the Levitical line from temple keepers to gatekeepers. To understand how the divine spiral was inverted into institutional control, we must go back to one of the original tribes, Levi, the priestly lineage. Like we talked about in the original architecture of the 12 tribes, each tribe held a tone, a sacred function. The Levites were the keepers of the temple. Their role was not to dominate, but to hold frequency, to mediate between the spiritual and physical realms, to protect sacred law and preserve vibrational integrity. But over time, through empire, trauma, and distortion, the Levitical tone was inverted. What began as sacred stewardship became spiritual elitism. Temple service was replaced by ritual control. And eventually, the Levites, once tone bearers, became gatekeepers. This priest class model was later inherited and restructured by the Roman Catholic Church. Now let's talk about from Levi to Rome. The Roman Church didn't invent religious control, it codified it. It took the inverted Levitical structure and turned it into institution. The priest became the authority between man and God. The temple became a cathedral of rules. The feminine was erased, demonized, or diminished. Gnosis was replaced by dogma. Coherence was replaced by obedience. And behind it all was the echo of the Levi inversion, a tribe that once held divine frequency, but whose function had been hijacked to serve empire. Now let's talk about the Essenes, the lineage that remembered. Not all of the Levites forgot. There was a mystical offshoot, a remnant who remembered the truth. They were called the Essenes. We talked about this group in the last episode. The Essenes were tone keepers. They held the Christic codes before the word Christ ever reached Greek translation. They lived in small, hidden communities, preserving sacred text, vibrational medicine, and spiritual technology long before the public ministry of Yeshua and Magdalene. Many of them were Levites, but not gatekeepers, grid keepers. They worked with breath, purity, sacred sound, solar and lunar cycles, and embodied gnosis. They remembered what divine service truly meant. And from this lineage came Mary, Yeshua, Magdalene, and the Christed spiral that would ripple through time. So let's talk about why this matters now. The Levi inversion didn't just create the church. It seeded a global pattern, where those meant to hold sacred tone became stewards of power and hierarchy instead. But the Essenes showed us another path, a template of remembrance, of what it means to be a priest of coherence, not control. So, where did the Essene lineage go? After the ministry of Yeshua and Magdalene and the escalating threat of Roman persecution, the Essene communities began to disappear from the historical record. But they didn't vanish, they dispersed. Some fled into the desert, some crossed the sea, some encoded their knowledge in scrolls and buried them in caves. Others passed it on orally, quietly through generations. And many simply became the wind, incarnating into future lineages, new lands, and unknown bodies to carry the spiral forward. Because the Essene lineage was never meant to stay in one place. It was never about holding on to form. It was about safeguarding frequency. And the real question isn't where the Essenes went. It's how their tone survived. The Essene frequency lives in you. Like the 12 tribes, the Essene lineage lives on not in just bloodline, but in tone. If you feel a sacred pull to remember, if you've always felt you carry ancient truth in your bones, if you speak in spiral, dream in light, and feel reverence for your body as temple, you may be part of the Essene field. And not because your ancestry can prove it, but because your field carries the resonance. You don't have to quote-unquote descend from the Essenes to carry the tone. This is important. In the Divine Integration Program, what matters is not whether your earthly bloodline ties back to a specific community, it's whether your frequency carries the memory. Because remember, this program is tone-based. Some of you are here to restore bloodlines from within, incarnating directly into distorted or forgotten lines to anchor coherence. Others are here to weave tones across lineages, bringing ancient knowledge into new cultural vessels. And some are here as first-wave spiral carriers, souls who predate the inversion, who seeded the tones before distortion ever entered the earth grid. If you feel drawn to the Essenes but have no idea why, that's your clue. It's not history calling you, it's memory. And this matters now because the Essene field is waking up again. Not as an institution, not as a religion, but as a frequency stream. It is returning through us, through bodies that remember how to hold light and form, through people who carry reverence in their tone, through those who treat coherence as sacred. The modern Essenes won't be found in a desert monastery. They'll be walking among us, in podcasts and healing rooms, in quiet gardens and sacred partnerships, in the kitchen, the breath, the body. They're the ones who weave silence into sound, stillness into presence, light into matter. And you'll recognize them not by their words, but by the way your nervous system exhales in their presence. They don't convert, they harmonize. If you're listening to this or reading this, if you followed this spiral of remembrance, it's likely because the Essene frequency is awakening in you. Whether you came through that tribe or entered from another stream, you are part of the returning spiral. And in this new harmonic, we don't rebuild Essene temples of old. We become them. We live in devotion, not performance. We create in coherence, not control. We remember gnosis not as doctrine, but as breath, tone, and embodied truth. Because the spiral never ended, it was encoded in us. And now, as we reweave the blueprint, the Essenes return, not as a past to reclaim, but as a tone to embody. This is how the Christ spiral spreads, not through belief, but through frequency. And the Essene field is one of its purest carriers. So if you feel it in your bones, if you hum with that quiet, ancient tone, welcome. You are the temple now, and the spiral remembers you. So that's all I have for this episode, and that wraps up the episode arc on the 12 tribes and the 12 strand DNA. I know this is a lot of information, so feel free to go to the podcast materials Google Drive and dive into the written transcripts or the companion notes. And stay tuned for part 4. It's on the new Atlantis, what America was meant to be. And that will come out on Tuesday. I love you all and have a great day.